Okay, good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Blair Elliott. I'm the Communication and Events Associate at the McGill Institute for the Study of Canada. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. While we meet today on a virtual platform, I would like to acknowledge that McGill University is located on land which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst Indigenous people, including the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe nations. We do this to acknowledge the importance of the land on which we work, study, and live, and to acknowledge the complex web of relationships of which we are all a part. We would like to welcome you tonight to the launch of The State of the System, a reality check on Canada's schools, a new book by Dr. Paul W. Bennett about the Canadian education order. We're looking forward to a conversation with Dr. Bennett tonight. There will be a Q&A following Dr. Bennett's lecture, and we invite you to use the Q&A box found at the bottom of your screen to put forth your questions at any point during the conversation. Tonight's webinar is being recorded, and it will be uploaded online to our YouTube channel next week, where you can watch this and all of MISC's past events. To start off tonight, I would like to introduce Danielle Belland, the Director of the McGill Institute for the Study of Canada, and James McGill Professor in the Department of Political Science at McGill University. Danielle?
Merci Blair, merci tout le monde. Thank you for attending this event. So the McGill Institute for the Study of Canada is the Center for Canadian, Quebec, and Indigenous Studies programs at McGill University. We support an interdisciplinary approach to the study of Canada by bringing together students, researchers, and practitioners to discuss important issues about the country's past, present, and future. In addition to our academic programs, MISC also hosts public events such as the book launch today. And so we have events on all different topics and issues, and we want to engage with people from both inside and outside the ivory tower. Tonight, we are really pleased to welcome Paul W. Bennett, the founding director of Schoolhouse Consulting and lead researcher at Schoolhouse Institute in Halifax, Nova Scotia. Currently inside the bubble, the COVID bubble. He is the national coordinator for research ed in Canada and an expert commentator covering a wide array of public policy issues in K-12 education across Canada. Dr. Bennett has a Doctor of Education degree from the Ontario Institute of Studies in Education, known as OISE at the University of Toronto. While living in Montreal back in 1997 to 2005, he served as the head of Lower Canada College and worked closely with the late Dr. Desmond Morton and MISC on a number of national history education projects. The State of the System is his 10th book, and in some ways builds upon his 2011 book, Vanishing Schools, Threatened Communities, the contested schoolhouse in maritime Canada, 1850 to 2010. Currently, he is the education columnist for Brunswick News, and his columns appear every second week in All New Brunswick Daily newspaper. So someone who publishes a lot, he just told me earlier before we went online about something he just published for the IRPP and another column. So very prolific author. Dr. Bennett, we are really pleased to have you tonight to talk about your new book. So I will let you present an overview of this major work of yours, and then I will return later to moderate the Q&A. So thanks again for accepting our invitation.
Well, good evening, and thank you for inviting me to give this presentation. Thank you especially to Danielle and members of the McGill Institute for hosting my Zoom launch. And we're getting pretty used to Zoom launches. And it's rare, though, that you get to make a presentation in a city that you once lived in. And it's particularly a pleasure for me because I have such fond memories of the McGill Institute I've always been a friend of the Institute since its very inception, and I always think of the dear and departed Desmond P. Morton. So Des, wherever you are, this one's for you. Let's go to the topic for tonight's presentation. It's a book launch with a title that is sure to grab you: The State of the System, a reality check on Canada's schools. It's a book that was probably 30 years in the making, and 5 years to write, and many, many years of observing, writing about, and critically examining the state of education. So if you want, it's the summation of a lot of work I've done over the years. I hope to share some of it with you tonight, and not too much, but enough to entice you to look further into the book. Today's school system is in crisis. And so let's start by looking briefly at what we've been through, the COVID pandemic and its impact. The school system shut down during the first phase of COVID was much like a power outage, which left students and parents in the dark, and educators were scrambling to master unfamiliar forms of education technology. Making radical adjustments following lockstep with public health directives was unusual because education is siloed like most systems, and it really upset the normal order in Canadian K-12 education. The centralized and overly bureaucratic school system described in my new book, The State of the System, proved to be vulnerable and, let's be honest, ill-equipped to respond to the massive pandemic disruption. Instead of rising to the challenges, however unexpected they were, public and provincial school leaders took refuge in what they knew best. They tended to cling to comfortable structures, ingrained policy responses. Two examples of this were focusing so much on straightening out the labor contracts and defining the hours of work, and then delaying for weeks on end e-learning implementation until all students had access to technology and the internet. Now, when it was over, we saw this. 3 months of school was essentially written off, and at least 1/4 of all students went missing or were unaccounted for in Canadian public education. It turned out to be, we now know, doing your best education under impossible circumstances, or, to be less charitable, a failure of pandemic proportions. Well, 8 months later, the system remains in what I would describe as disequilibrium, especially in provinces like Quebec wrestling with the highest rates of COVID infection. What emerged to fill the vacuum is what online learning expert Michael K. Barber aptly termed triage schooling in the educational emergency room, aimed at stabilizing the condition of a shaken K-12 system. 3 months of slapped together home learning produced predictable results: bored and tuned out students, exhausted parents, and of course, exasperated teachers. The education fallout from the COVID epidemic is having a lasting impact, as we see since September 2020 and the resumption of in-person schooling. We have new school regulations, we have social distancing, hybrid learning. They've all added new complications. And the hidden cost, of course, and one that we're starting to see, is student learning loss. Why the system was so fragile and vulnerable is fully explored in my latest book. Let's look at the term, the modern bureaucratic education state, because it's a term I use throughout the book. The modern bureaucratic education state is what I describe as the current condition of all systems. It has a problem, and the roots run very deep. Since the rise and expansion of the modern bureaucratic school system over the past 100 years, public education in Canada has grown far more distant and much less connected with students, families, teachers, and even communities. Our schools were initially established in the public domain as the vanguard of universal, accessible, free education. But over time, they lost their way and became largely unresponsive to the public they still claim to serve. Let me deal a little bit with the theory and the structure of the book. When you look at the book, you will see that I have taken a new view of educational history. If there was ever a field that was ripe for reinterpretation, it's educational history. What my book provides is a structural analysis of the rise of the bureaucratic education state. And it goes back to the origins of state schooling. It was, of course, common schools and free schools in the traditional view, but in reality, there was a movement to bring social order to the populace. And Canadian historian Ian Mackay has termed that the project of liberal rule. There was an educational component to this, an educational variation on that theme. While state schooling had its origins in the 1840s, centralization and bureaucratization was largely the creature, in my view, of a 50-year period from the 1940s to the 1990s. That phase represented, in my view, the triumph of the modern bureaucratic education state. And here, let me make a reference to Quebec. This is a term familiar to most Quebecers because Hubert Gwindon in 1968 referred to the Quiet Revolution itself as Quebec's bureaucratic revolution. That too is in the book. School consolidation has been a focus of my research for years, and I see it as the outward manifestation of state expansion, drawing sustenance from expanding school enrollments until the mid-1970s, and then becoming a matter of survival, financial necessity, amidst a phase of contracting enrollment. It became a matter of protecting that which was built up. Ontario's Royal Commission on Learning from 1993 to 1995, I see as a bit of a turning point, because there in that document, you see, for everyone to see, the reality of the school system, that it was much like a fortress, a well-funded and bloated institution at the center, and not particularly accountable to students, parents, or anyone that didn't reside within the system. Let me take you through the stages in the evolution of the modern bureaucratic state, all detailed in the book. There were 4 distinct or discrete stages, in my view. First, the formation of the education state. This was the period of the common schools and the one-room schoolhouse era. Then we see consolidation and centralization, the emergence of consolidated schools, palace schools in the cities, and of course, something that I've written a lot about, the one big unit. Everything was to be fit into a one big unit of district organization. Now, consolidation happened in the next phase. And consolidation, that's the next slide. Consolidation started with the baby boom, and the school system expanded dramatically. Schools became systems, and enrollments mushroomed. And what we see too is teacher organizations became bigger and much more integrated into the school system. The last phase is the one we're probably most familiar with, the triumph of the modern education state. That's where we see the blob starting to gain dominance, and we see an era of neoliberal reform and testing and accountability. Now, I knew you'd be attracted by my description of the blob, so let's take a look at the blob. And that starts with a question. Who actually is in charge of today's school system? It's becoming harder and harder to answer that question because there are different layers. There's administrative buildup. The term that's used in the US and the UK, but hardly ever in Canada, for the education establishment is the blob. It's not used here because I find we're much too polite to describe things in those terms. We have to go to, say, American Education Secretary William Bennett back in 1987 in Education Week. He wrote an article where he said that the blob actually was this: people, superintendents, district office staff, and school trustees in the education system who work outside the classroom, soak up resources, and resist reform without contributing at all to student achievement. Of course, the term the blob is rarely used because it's a 1950s film where an amoeba-like alien mass expands and there was nothing you could do to contain or stop its expansion. I prefer a phrase used by St. Francis Xavier University political scientist Peter Clancy, in a 2000 book describing the savage revolution in Nova Scotia, he's called basically the establishment the core interests, namely education's insiders, senior provincial officials, superintendents, principals, and of course, growing numbers of in-house consultants. My book is quite unique in one respect. It's one of the few books on education which attempts to look at the school system from the outside looking in. Most books about education are written by insiders themselves, often by architects of the very system they purport to analyze, or people who have their own pet projects or themes that they want to develop. The school system from the outside looking in can be likened to what Jennifer Lewington and Graham Orkwood described back in 1993 as a fortress. If you look on the right, you see a diagram. Looks rather crude, but I think it serves its purpose. It shows the boundaries that separate the insiders from the outsiders in education. And when I took a look at the period from 1993 to the present, I came to this conclusion: not a whole lot has changed. Let me give you some examples. Voicing concerns about the state of our public schools can be, and still is, exceedingly frustrating. And more often than not, it's an exercise in futility. Parents advocating mathematics improvements, or reading curriculum reforms, families seeking improved special needs programs, or communities fighting small school closures in rural Canada regularly hit two things. They hit brick walls or they hit glass ceilings. During the COVID-19 shutdown, the fragility of the impenetrable fortress was exposed to everyone, and everyone had a chance to see that it wasn't quite as impregnable or as invincible as it seemed. There are 5 pillars identified in fortress education, and in case you're wondering, this is a modern education fortress, the headquarters of the Calgary Board of Education. Most of what Jennifer Lewington and Orkwood identified in Overdue Assignment in 1993, which they called the iron rules of protection, sustaining fortress education, they all remain essentially intact. And I have a section on each one of these. 1, centralized rigid bureaucracy. 2, resistance to learning and teaching research. 3, teaching as a secular priesthood. 4, stagnation of teacher training and development. And 5, the use and abuse of student results. We have student results now, but we also have transparency without accountability, the further evolution of what's happened. I use the term bureaucratic managerialism to describe the state of affairs today. It's not my term, it's very much in the literature. And the system, originally conceived, as we all know, as a liberal reform enterprise, aimed at expanding mass schooling and broadening access to the populace, had largely achieved its goals about 25 years ago, in my view. Having achieved near universal access, school authorities in the 1980s began to pivot towards introducing bureaucratic managerialism in the form of what is called instructionally focused educational systems. A new educational language emerged, which British education professor and Dutch-born sociologist Gert Biesta termed learnifications. Students became learners, teaching was termed facilitating learning, and classrooms were known as learning environments. Let's talk about the rise of the systematizers in K-12 education. And many of you will, if you're in education, will recognize the man pictured here. That's Dr. Michael Fullan, the greatest school change theorist of the entire period. School change theorists like Fullan of Toronto's OISE emerged in the 1980s to initiate a North American wave of structural reform. They saw incoherence from classroom to classroom, teachers teaching in different ways, and they thought that was a problem. And from one classroom to another, they wanted to see more consistency, and teacher autonomy they saw as an obstacle to further modernization. So school change came to mean supplanting the things that teachers did best: didactic instruction, knowledge-based curricula, teaching of basic skills. And in their place, they put things which were nebulous and had terms like ambitious instructional experiences and outcomes for all students. At the school district level, it was reflected in new forms of school consolidation aimed at turning loose aggregations of schools into what are now school systems. There are three distinct levels here to look at in the bureaucratization of education: the provincial and district level, the school level, and the classroom level. I deal with each in the book, and there's plenty on each if you care to go in a little more deep and a little deeper. The new interface for you and I and anyone in education in the K-12 sector are education centers, where you quickly see layers of administration. There's layers of administration, big box elementary schools, supersized high schools. They all testify to the dominance of the trend. What you see here is one school board, the Windsor-Essex Catholic District School Board. It could be anywhere. They all look essentially the same. Elected school boards, the last vestige of local education democracy, are now considered simply nuisances and fast becoming a threatened species. I have to say a word too about the mythology that comes along with systematization. Some of you will have heard of something called 21st century learning skills. You'll remember that we were supposed to have them in place before the pandemic. But educators have been talking about this for 20 or 30 years. Global learning corporations like Pearson International and Google, they've achieved a tremendous dominance in the educational world through the spread of educational technology and licensed learning resources. But they're finally attracting some critical scrutiny, because when kids are at home in their kitchens with their parents, parents start asking questions. What is this 21st century learning? Does it exist? And why are the students still showing major skill deficits in mathematics and literacy? Immersed in a virtual world, the pandemic generation, which is those in school today, what they really need is what I've been describing as future-proof education, not 21st century learning. They need to be able to critically examine the world that is around them. And this will be of music to the ears of people watching and listening tonight. A sound liberal education, knowledge-rich curriculum, and critical thinking capacities are still the best preparation for navigating an uncertain present and an unpredictable future. I'm not saying it because I thought you'd nod. It's in the book. A bit on Quebec, and I want to spend some time because much of Canadian educational history and politics has a blind spot. It excludes Quebec. And having lived in Quebec, I had my eyes opened. So one thing I set out to do in this book was put Quebec into the history of education in Canada and the politics of the period. And so I attempt, at least as much as I could, to have examples from the Quebec education system. But here you can see that universal education takes on a completely different form in contemporary Quebec. And I do talk about the formation of the Ministry of Education. This is Paul Bennett sitting in his office. And of course, the bureaucratization of education came to Quebec a bit later through the Quiet Revolution. I do discuss Pierre Elliott Trudeau's brand of multiculturalism and the Quebec government's response, interculturalism. I look at how different Quebec policy is and how this is reflected in the school system. And this interculturalism, as you all know, is a common language of cultural interaction, which embraces pluralism, and it claims to be highly sensitive to the protection of rights. In the book, I do discuss, though, how secularism and reasonable accommodation have come to the fore in the recent past. Quebec's cultural distinctiveness, which was once, as we all know, tied up with Catholic identity, has become more and more aligned with Francophone, secular state, laicity, or the separation of religion from government. And I know that's a gross simplification. It's much more detailed in the book. But over the past 2 decades, what's emerged and dominated political discourse is convulsions affecting recently arrived immigrant families and Anglo-Quebecers. They're very accustomed to periodic surges of Quebec national sentiment played out in the schools. The flashpoint, of course, is Bill 21 in the schools, and I don't want to go off track tonight and go into this in too much detail, but I use it as an example in the book of how the Quebec school system is uniquely different. Universality takes on different forms, and reasonable accommodation becomes very much a part of how these things get sorted out, and especially when it comes to restrictions on religious symbols and attire. So in other words, promoting universality exposes underlying tensions in Quebec education. That makes it unique, but this won't surprise anyone watching tonight. Let's return to the present, because everyone talks about building back education in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. So of course, I have to try to establish that in my book, there are connections. And I do. In fact, the book takes the metaphor of the iron cage and talks about Max Weber, the great German sociologist, and his famous iron cage. And I use it as a metaphor for what's gone wrong with education, and so that those inside it feel like captives and those outside it are trying to find ways of getting in. But the iron cage was exposed during the shutdown of COVID, and we came to see just how dependent students, teachers, and families were on provincial and school district directives from the top down. So what I say in the book is we now need what we've always probably known as cage-busting leadership to transform schools into more autonomous social institutions that first and foremost serve students, families, and communities. Let's move, as the book does, from diagnosis to venturing a prescription. And unlike a lot of books on education, I have the temerity to actually propose some ways out of the current morass. And I start with decentralized governance and self-governing schools. Some 40 years after the advent of decentralized democratic governance, which is called school-based management, you'll find that provincial authorities and regional centers remain wedded to a system-wide management of virtually every aspect of educational service. What is needed, I think, is a complete rethink of provincial and school district governance, and a commitment to clear away those obstacles and to build a more agile, responsive community of self-governing schools that puts students first. There's a lot of talk about that, but little evidence that it's happening. Without re-engineering education from the schools up, I don't think this is going to happen. A second goal I have is humanizing education and building schools from the ground up. A lot is made of decentralized management and control, but doing that and flipping the system will have little or no effect in what really matters, teaching and learning in the schools. I see decentralization as just the first stage in an overall strategy to make our schools more democratic, responsive, and accountable to parents, teachers, students, and communities. Students should come first in the schools. And in my view, it's best achieved in smaller schools operating on a human student scale. And there is a movement called the Human Scale Movement in the 1980s to the present, which shone a light on the critical need to right-size, particularly high schools, which by and large are far too big to involve reciprocal relationships and to build communities. And the guiding practices of the Human Scale Movement influenced me greatly, particularly the enhancement of student voices and genuine partnerships with parents. They come out of smaller schools. A third focus for change should be on teaching-centered classrooms. And here you're saying, wait a minute, that's heresy. We've got student-centered classrooms, but you aren't seeing it wrong. I'm recommending teaching-centered classes, not teacher-centered, teaching-centered classrooms. Moving teachers and what they do back to the center stage. You know, teachers are clamoring for a much larger role in setting priorities and determining what happens in today's schools. Centralized, bureaucratic, top-down education generates cycles of new mandates, many rebranded and recycled from previous years. School district consultants and outside experts, as you see here, this poor teacher. They flit around monitoring progress and attempting to introduce new pedagogies. Most often they tell teachers you're doing it wrong and you need to make changes. Now, mastering new technocratic language is how you get ahead in education, but it's called learnification. It becomes the passport to advancement and accession to senior administrative roles. The dominance of this language, promulgated by ministries of education and education faculties, only subverts the real point of education: to learn something, to learn it from someone, and to learn it for a reason. Those are essential, but above all, to learn something from someone. Now, challenging education gurus and their unproven educational theories is going to be essential if we're to base teaching on evidence-based practice and what really works with students in the classroom. Community engagement. Oh my goodness, engaging parents in family-centric schools is a big part of what I'm proposing. Now, parent engagement is now part of the standard educational lexicon, but in practice, it's incredibly hard to find it exhibited, particularly during COVID-19 and the disruption. It was almost as if students were at home, working with teachers, and parents were on the outside looking in. There wasn't enough of a relationship or community engagement or parent engagement. And one of Canada's leading researchers on parent-school relations, Debbie Peshore, of the University of Saskatchewan, makes a clear distinction between school-managed parent involvement and genuine parent engagement. School superintendents, consultants, and many school principals, I'm sure you know, they've got a lot to unlearn, because school management is not school-managed parent relations is not engagement. What we really need is a completely different model, the family-centric approach, embracing a philosophy of walking alongside parents, genuinely supporting the active engagement of families that make up the school community. In other words, family-centric schools, not schools which invite you in and you realize you're on their turf. Looking ahead, we do need to seize the day. The book is actually a clarion call for educational reform. And we know that provincial governments in large swaths of Canada, and even in Quebec, nowhere really more evident than in Quebec, have eliminated or are neutering locally elected boards and moving dramatically in the direction of centralizing control over their systems. Now, without access to school-level education governance, a role, a voice, some impact, concerned parents, educators, and the public, let's face it, they were left with limited access and nowhere to turn to address the host of problems that came out of the first phase of COVID-19 pandemic, and in the second phase, where there's massive confusion in the schools. That comes down to public choice in education. I see signs of a shift. Emergency distance learning was, in the words of an article in Toronto Life, an unmitigated disaster. Coming out of the 3-month school-long shutdown, a 2-month housebound summer holiday, and a turbulent September startup, parents are either embracing or seriously considering the full range of alternative school options. It's a wake-up call for the system. The COVID-19 pandemic has shaken confidence in public education. Now, hundreds of thousands of students and parents are opting out of in-person schooling, choosing online, and gravitating to alternative school options, including home education and learning pods. So if there was ever a time to address the critical issues in education, it's now. I'd like to turn to a wrap-up. We need to embrace the future and take a positive approach. A new set of priorities are emerging, or they should be. Put students first. Deprogram education ministries and school districts. Listen more to parents and teachers in the schools. Design and build smaller schools at the center of neighborhoods and rural communities. And in the midst of the pandemic, I think we're more aware of the need for meaningful public engagement. And we know now that we need to rebuild social capital and revitalize local communities. New school options, which were considered improbable solutions just a few months ago are looking more attractive. And we know that many are exploring alternatives to the system, independent education, virtual schools, and pandemic learning pods, to name just a few. So I think the time has come to address the system and the crisis of the bureaucratic education state. With my book comes a call to turn the system right side up and to chart a more constructive, positive path forward. Re-engineering the system is essentially, in my view, about taking back our schools. Thank you for your attention. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much for your wonderful presentation. Very clear. Obviously, the book is very ambitious. It covers a lot of ground. I think it's based on a deep knowledge of the field, obviously, but also not just practical knowledge, but historical knowledge. And I think it's important to understand what's happening today, including during the COVID crisis, and kind of a long-term historical perspective. And I think you laid that out very, very nicely in your presentation. Now we'll invite people to ask questions. And the way you do this is we have a chat box, and also there's a Q&A box. And so you can just type your question, and then I will ask it to Paul. I can call you Paul. And while people are writing the questions, I have a couple of questions for you. First of all, learnification is your critique of learnification is very interesting, and I saw, so yesterday in Policy Options you published an article called "Will the Pandemic Help Shift the Education System Back to Teaching?" And you really offer a critique of learnification, which is also in your book, as I gather. So can you tell us more a bit concretely, how does that work? What are the concrete effects of that ideology, if we can call it an ideology, on actual practices in the classroom?
Well, first of all, it started in the 1980s, and it actually is an outgrowth of student-centered education. The idea that that students are learners, learning is desirable, and teachers shouldn't be at the center of instruction. They need to be, first of all, we had the first phase of this was the sage on the stage. Then it became the guide on the side. And in my book, I refer to the peer at the rear, which is the, the way the paradigm shifts. So how it plays out is this. When you are brought to a faculty of education and you're brought into teaching, you're told that you should be facilitating learning. So you say, well, no, I want to teach. No, you're facilitating learning. Why do you want to be a teacher? You don't say, I want to teach. You say, I want to work with students and I want to teach them to learn. I want learning to be. So everything we have is actually named learning, if you think about it. And even the province of Ontario, when it did a review of its evaluation, was called the Learning Province. So learnification is something like Kleenex. It's so ever present that you don't notice it. But I think Gert Biesta, in his book, Rediscovering Teaching, goes into a tremendous amount of detail. He's a brilliant scholar, but I have to say it's impenetrable. It's very, very hard. I think the only reason learnification isn't better known is it's very, very hard to peel away the layers of analysis he brings to it. So in short, learnification is the technocratic language of education that puts distance between you as a student and the teacher, that puts distance between the parent and the teacher, and it keeps the system at length because it's the language of education. Some call it edubabble, edu-speak. Learnification is encrusted in education. For example, the pandemic came, parents are in their homes trying to help their children, and everything that learnification does, which is you facilitate discussion, you have cooperative learning, everything is about learning in groups and so on. It's next to impossible to implement in the current environment. And the emerging, I call distance, the keep your distance education is actually very difficult to implement learnification strategies. So in short, learning replaces teaching. And I'm making the case that we need to move teaching back to the center, not so much teachers, the act and practice of teaching.
Very good. I have another question, but I will wait because we have a question here in the chat. Great synopsis of a much needed book. Question to Paul, for Paul. To what extent do you think that the response to the pandemic exposed the centralized control falls on its face in addressing rapid changing conditions? In all provinces, the Ministry of Education abdicated responsibility and true responsibility back on school districts and individual schools. Is there a lesson here for parents and public education?
I really think that's a great question because that cuts to the core of the book. And most of my initial talks were on this very subject. It was like a power outage, and the school system, it's like the lights went out. And it was almost, it was sad to watch superintendents on Zoom talking to people in their systems who, the Toronto District Board of Education, I watched the Zoom talks, and it was as if the army was still there. It was like people were still following orders. The truth of the matter was, everyone was in their homes. They were in a pandemic state of urgency. And it was really, once again, teachers interacting directly with students, with parents trying to figure out where they belong. It kind of brought schooling back to its core principles. And it did expose the weakness in the system, which it isn't agile. It's far too bureaucratic. It's top down. And they don't give enough responsibility to teachers. So that when they're thrust into a situation like that, they're always, where's the direction? And I think teachers would benefit from more autonomy. They would have, I think, fared better and felt more confident about leading our way out of the pandemic.
Thank you. We are waiting for more questions. So in the chat and the Q&A, I see something in the Q&A that just appeared. What are some of the hallmarks of a family-centered school? Family-centered school.
Well, I think it's really important that we spend time getting to know families and developing direct relationships with them. We know from the research that students do better when families are involved and engaged. And one of the great frustrations of teachers is the parents don't come to a parents' night, or you invite them to come in. What I think Debbie Peshor has done is show that you kind of have to go and meet them halfway. You kind of have to meet them on their ground. You can't always ask them to come to the school. There's a bit of this, I would say, the family doctor who visited the homes. I think on neutral ground, I'm a big advocate of meeting parents on neutral ground and trying to get to know them, going where they are and reaching out a bit more. In actual fact, I think you build stronger relationships. A lot of parents had bad experiences in school. They never want to be back. And they're the very ones you want to engage. So we can't reach them because the last thing they want to do is walk across that entrance to the school. So particularly those that have had struggles themselves, have language challenges, or have kids with special needs, it's very hard unless you meet them on their own. I wouldn't go quite as far as Debbie Peshor in saying that you should have an organized program like that. I think you just got to make it a commitment. And I would say, you meet them halfway, you meet them where they are. You know the phrase, meet them where they are? It's never done in education. They're invited in. Right away, they see the Delphi system. They're divided up into groups that the educators have organized. That's so they can't get together and organize any orchestrated response. And everything is organized to prevent them from actually expressing freely their views. Unfortunately, that's what happens when it becomes parent management and not parent engagement.
Yeah, that's a useful distinction. So another question here. If these changes took place as you recommend, what impact will that have on the curriculum, the improvement of the training of teachers, and better results for students?
Well, first of all, teachers have a lot to gain from the prescriptions in my book. It's very clearly a book that advocates that teachers deserve to be listened to. They're saying an awful lot of the right things. They're the ones, in my view, who want to flip the system. What I find that falls short is they don't bring parents along. They don't bring the other partners along. So there's a section in the book where I say they need to bring parents into the equation, and it can't just be. So what's the changes in the curriculum? I think what's really important is to have a defined curriculum. I'm quite clear on this. I think the curriculum has to be knowledge-based. I think it has to, it can't be a curriculum that parents take over. That shouldn't really be in their territory. I think we need to listen to them on how to do a better job educating children and the things that they're expert in, but not to, if you want, delegate to them the responsibility for developing curriculum. So I talk more about the importance of having sound curriculum that stands the test of time. I'm not advocating that we cede to parents much in the way of curriculum responsibility. We have a right, they have a right to be consulted, but I actually think I'm fairly conservative on that particular question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's that, because there are always risks if you do that. That some groups of parents could organize to, for example, advocate an anti-science agenda, or we see that in the United States happening on a regular basis, for example, where you have to teach evolution and creationism on the same level and so forth. So is it what you're afraid of if parents will take control of it?
There are risks in delegating to parents more responsibility. There are risks in self-governing schools. That's why I put so much emphasis on the development of communities. I don't recommend that you go right to school-based management or school-based governance. I'm of the view that you need to take 2 or 3 years to develop leadership within the schools, get everybody to the point where they're prepared to assume those responsibilities, and they know that they are accountable for what they're doing. They're not just doing it on their own. And then I would move then to coordinating bodies. One of the big criticisms of my book, it's come out several times, and I'll throw it out, maybe it'll seed some interest here, but what about resources flowing to those who've got the most already? What about inequities that are there? And I'm very clear about this. I say that we don't want to cede everything to the schools. There will always be a need for certain resources to be shared. They will be shared for accessibility. They'll be shared for inclusion. They'll be shared for those who are English second language learners and those who have newly arrived in the country and need all the supports so there has to be a balance. But I'm actually advocating that we shift dramatically in the direction of putting more of the resources into the schools. I asked the question, what would happen if we focused on strengthening schools and pouring all of our resources into improving schools and not the system? Like the system could, as far as I'm concerned, wither away. It won't, but.
Yeah. Thank you. Maybe shrink a bit, right? At least. We have a question here, and actually I will mention the name because she's writing it in the question. So Patty Bacchus, I'm not sure how to say it, Bacchus from
Patty
BC. Bacchus, yes, like the god, yes.
From
okay, yes.
Uh-huh.
I'm interested to hear more about what you think the role of school boards could or should be moving forward, and whether they are a lost cause. Do you have advice for current trustees who want to stay relevant? And that's a big issue in Quebec school boards. You know, you mentioned Quebec, and François Legault and the CAQ is anti-school board, as you know. So I would like you to answer this question, but maybe also add maybe your thoughts about the situation in Quebec and what François Legault wants to do and this project of eliminating school boards. Why is it appealing that some politicians are actively pursuing that?
I have a whole chapter on school boards in crisis, and Patty, thank you for watching tonight. I hope you're doing well out there in Vancouver or on the island. And I enjoy your columns. So thank you for raising that question. No surprise, you're asking me about school boards. We both have something in common. I served for 9 years on a public school board, so I know them from the inside out. And I do share your concerns about the current state of school boards. But in fairness, you know, they've actually put themselves in jeopardy. You probably will see in the book, I've got an 8-point critique of current school board governance, so I won't go through each of those. But it starts with the governance philosophy. I find most of the school board members don't really understand their role, or they're easily influenced by the administration. So the book is, in many ways, shows how the administrative buildup involved almost the pacification, domestication of elected board members to the point where they became virtually an extension of the administration. And if you challenged that, you ended up finding yourself in jeopardy. So they did succeed in not only clipping the wings of many elected board members, but actually ensuring that that didn't happen. So the school board governance philosophy needs a complete change, putting more responsibility where it belongs. The elected representatives have to have a raison d'etre. We need to put an end to what McKinnon called role identity confusion. They don't know what they're there for, who they represent, and the governance policy and practices have made it more confusing. I would say this: there is hope for elected democratic elections in the school board level, but I think we need, first of all, to replace them. The book actually makes a case that they need to be phased out and we need to start all over again. Start with the schools, elect meaningful school governing councils, and then evolve over a 4 or 5 year period into coordinating bodies, and make sure that those serving on those regional coordinating bodies have a mandate to represent their schools, that we don't need people. As Patty knows, school boards are too big and the job is too challenging to be a part-time job as presently constituted. That's another issue. And thank you for raising the question.
Okay, just on Quebec, I'm wondering if you can say something, since you talk quite a bit about Quebec and we have this debate in Quebec right now about school boards. There's an issue with the English language schools and so forth, but also a broader debate about the future of school boards. So is there something specific about the debate in Quebec and the CAQ's position on this, or do you think it's something that's normal or usual?
Your participation rates in the school board elections were so low. And when I lived there, I realized the fundamental problem. Those elections need to be on municipal election day. Right away, you'd have 40 or 50%. I was shocked to realize that the school board elections in Quebec were on their own separate day, and the participation rates were 20, 30% below. They were 15%, 12%. So the school boards went out of business because of lack of participation. It's called acclimation disease. That was the fundamental problem. It was a structural problem. In Quebec, it's interesting. You do have school governing councils, but there's a weird relationship. The school board members on the district boards didn't really they weren't accountable to those school governing councils. So you've got better school governing councils than they do in other provinces, in my view, more responsibility, and you have a longer track record of them. But you had these regional boards, which was there's no term limitations. They had all the problems of the school boards. I actually recommended school-based management for Quebec. I wrote an article in the Montreal Gazette. Some of your viewers tonight will remember I wrote 2 or 3 articles about the need to reform the Quebec school board system. And I thought you should start again building from the schools up.
Thank you. We have more questions, so I will actually ask, maybe, can I ask you the few questions in a row and you can answer them? Yeah, okay, let's do that.
Them.
Very popular. So great book. I really enjoyed it. And it has I am curious if you have any suggestion for increasing school responsibility and autonomy for schools that have a high turnover in their staffing. Is there a way to make meaningful change at the school level without staff consistency? Now I will just move to
maybe I could give you quick answers.
Yeah, go for it. Yeah,
and deal with them very quickly, and not give you. So the first thing is school leadership is critical in a retention of staff, and it's central to my plan, which is you have to develop a new generation of school leaders who welcome and encourage engagement, and that includes engagement with teachers. Involve them in decision making, because you can't treat the teachers any differently than you do with the parents. So involving the teachers, involving the parents is part of a single process, and you have less tendency for turnover. The other thing is it's a sign of a school in trouble if there's too much turnover. So my approach would be, it will be much more visible if you have school-based management, because questions will be asked. Why is this school not performing as well as the others?
Very good. So we have still 3 more questions. So I will stop taking new questions now, but all the questions that have been written down, I will ask them to you. And it's good to have short, crisp answers like the last one. That's great.
I'll try.
It's tough, but these are very good questions. So first one, can you comment on the role of teacher education programs in some of the big issues in Canadian education? What should those programs be doing that they aren't? What are they doing that they shouldn't be?
Well, first of all, they're not addressing the critical issues as I define them. It's a sad reality in education research in Canada that if you take the critical issues that are in my book, I had to first go to sources outside Canada to start the research on them. Or there are articles that are excellent that get no coverage and no distribution in the faculties of education. Dennis Raffel's article on why we got provincial testing in Ontario deserves to be studied in every course, but it's in none of the courses because the people in the faculties of education, they don't want standardized testing. So the last thing they want to teach to incoming students is how we got standardized testing and why it's an improvement over no accountability in the school system. So that's just one example on standardized testing. There has to be a genuine dialogue about that. You won't find it. Another thing that's quite evident is the faculties of education. They have their own view of the world, and they have their own approaches. I'm very sensitive. I don't think they produce the best research. They're always the first to complain that they're not regarded as a full faculty. They're not accepted in academe. But the truth of the matter is, just take a look at what they're producing, and it isn't quite at the stage. Another thing wrong with faculties of education is all their research is based on such small samples. It's actually action research is what they keep talking about, but what that is somebody's pet idea that they're researching to prove it's the right idea. Or in the area of, say, education guru thinking, is you read a book and it's somebody's theoretical view on that, and it's taught as fact, or it's indisputable and can't be challenged. And I don't think it serves education well. We should be training teachers to be critical thinkers. Or as Tom Bennett says, we need to remember to remind them that the most important asset is to have a built-in crap detector.
Very good, thanks. Question from Jim Christopher. He identifies himself in the before the question, so I will mention his name. Following up on my question about the mole falling on its face, is centralized funding the problem? In my experience as a superintendent in Ontario prior to centralized funding, boards funded by property tax were far more sensitive to local issues and more autonomous, as funding nurtured school boards.
Yes, centralization has eroded the effectiveness of school boards as more and more decisions get transferred to the province and less is given to the school boards. And I think what's critical, there's quite a bit of research on this, on centralization and the weakening of school board authority. There is a relationship with provincial testing too, and what is micromanaging schools. A lot of I would say superintendents are terrified of micropolitics, which is at the school level, and they'll do anything to shut down micropolitics. But as teachers and true educators know, micropolitics is what you live for, which is people coming to you with a concern you need to resolve, keeps you alive. But there's this attitude that let's keep micropolitics out of education. Here's another fallacy, that things in education aren't political. Oh my goodness, well, no, it's the reverse. They're presented as indisputable truths. That's politics. If you start asking questions, you quickly find out, wait a minute here, you're either not welcome to ask questions, or how did he get in? It's a weird thing. You get probably ignored. Listen and ignore. That's the first line of response. And then marginalize and eliminate that particular influence. That's the way the system protects itself.
Thank you. Another question. In your book, you mentioned research ed and the need for more evidence-based practices in education. Can you tell us a little bit more about the role played by organizations such as this one?
Well, research, teachers, it starts with teachers, their everyday experience. And they need themselves to take a look at research and to be better informed on what the research says. And what they're going to discover is most of the best research supports their best instincts. So they'd be more inclined to say, I want to teach. They won't be shy about saying, I want to teach a subject. They won't shy away from, saying, I'm not sure this is working. I'll give you an example from the world of education, the real world. You get all kinds of ideas coming forward, differentiated instruction. I don't know why teachers accepted that. Because it basically says you've got 25 students, and then you're going to have 28 students, and you're going to have 20 students with various special needs, and you're going to differentiate for every one of them? Why didn't somebody say, hold on, this isn't humanly possible? And if we differentiate for every different student, what happens to our achievement levels? Do we care? No, we need to aggregate students in groups where you can actually do something meaningful with them. I just think that whole idea, it was accepted without question. Differentiated instruction. You wouldn't get anybody, I was in staff meetings, you wouldn't get anybody asking a question about it. Unless they did some reading and I think, wait a minute, is it possible for me to differentiate instruction in my class to this degree that they're suggesting? Of course not. Nobody did it. They just went to sessions and pretended they did. So that's a key example of, and there are many of these ideas that are promulgated. I think that's what I speak about when I say teachers armed with the best evidence. They will know, for example, that minimally guided instruction doesn't work. The more guided the instruction is, the higher student achievement. Another thing, class size. Let's talk about that. Class size is not the most important effect in student achievement. It's who's in the class and whether they're prepared to learn. It's not the class size so much. So those are issues. Another thing that I think is important in research ed, in 3 areas they're dominant. Math education. Why is it that we continually talk about how students can't do math? Why is it that 30 or 40 years since we started systematic literacy, why are we still debating why kids can't read? And, essentially, why is there no discussion in education of student behavior and conduct? In the average faculty of education, it's mentioned for a week or so. And yet the first thing you find when you're in a secondary school is that's your biggest concern. is student behavior. How do I work with students? So all of those issues were unacknowledged and unaddressed by faculties of education. They, in fact, encouraged things that were not working, and they continue to do so. So those are specific examples.
Thank you. A couple more last questions. So how does private education play into your future of public education? And I think it resonates here in, for example, in Quebec, where private schools are so important in terms of the percentage of students, in part because of compromise that was made in the 1960s during the Quiet Revolution, something you mentioned earlier. So in some provinces, it's more important than others. But overall, what's the role of private education in your own vision of the future of public education?
I'm often asked this because, as everyone who knows me well knows, I'm one of these very, very strange people that's taught in both public and private or independent education. I've moved between the two, and I've spent the last decade or more entirely focused on public education. I'm also a product of public education. I was in public education for 14 years, and I was an elected board member in the York Region District School Board. And I spent a good deal of my time teaching. So I would say half my career was spent in public education and the other half in independent schools of one sort or another. So I'm well positioned to answer that question. But I am not in favor of funding private schools or independent schools. I'm not in favor of it. I know you have it in Quebec. I certainly was well aware of it when I was there in Quebec. But I just don't think that the public school system can sustain that. The resources get stretched out. I think what's more important is that public education take examples from independence and make better use of what they see working. I've spent my entire life trying to reform public education. This book is just the latest example. So I am passionate about the need to reform the public education system to make it the kind of system we want. My own little consulting business is basically says sound ideas and better practices and better schools. And they are the public schools, in my estimation. We've got a big job ahead of us.
Thank you. Last question. Can you elaborate on your preference for knowledge-based curriculum while making reference to Quebec's current skills-based curriculum? So the difference between knowledge-based and skills-based curriculum.
Competency-based education is all the rage. If you go to any faculty of education, you find out that we don't need grading, we don't need marks, we actually need competencies, and who cares about what the final averages are or the recommended marks for universities? They're all just constructs that don't mean a whole lot. We want competencies. Well, competencies are a huge mistake. First of all, is it 6 competencies or 16? The OECD can't decide. All the research points to the question of which are the competencies. And here's another thing that's really interesting is, are there going to be social and cultural competencies in there, social and emotional competencies? So which 6 are you going to pick? If you're in the United States, you know what's in there? Grit, determination, competition. If you're in Canada, say in Ontario, People for Education, they don't even include grit, conscientiousness, and growth mindset. They're not part of their thing. What's in there is empathy, support for others, and so on and so forth. It's a completely different view. So in my view, it's not implementable. And I'll tell you what teachers say. The competencies don't match what we teach and how we teach. And so they can't be evaluated. And Linda Duckworth, who's the best known authority on this, she wrote a very famous book on grit, and she was appointed to the California State Board looking at implementing social and emotional education. And she quit and said, it's the wrong idea. It can't be done. I'm actually sorry I suggested it.
Thank you very much, Paul. It's a great way to end this discussion. We had a lot of questions, and I thank all the people who attended today. I also, of course, thank you for your wonderful presentation and for writing this very timely book. You know, we are here at the McGill Institute for the Study of Canada organizing a lot of different events. Tomorrow we have at 7 p.m. Eastern, we have the Mallory Lecture featuring Federal Minister of Justice and Attorney General David Lametti, 7 p.m. Eastern, and you can still sign up online. We are on Twitter, we are on Facebook, and if you want to see our webpage, it's McGill/MISC, and you can sign up for our newsletter and of course follow us on social media. Merci beaucoup de votre attention et on espère vous revoir demain soir pour l'allocution de monsieur du ministre Lametti. Passez une bonne soirée et à la prochaine. Take care.